I spent 10 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit. Watch how one forensic mistake finally set me free. I was just 20 years old, fresh out of college, dreaming of becoming an engineer when they broke down my door at dawn. I remember the thin strip of sunlight creeping under my bedroom door, and how I'd been half asleep, clutching my calculus textbook. In an instant, my world crumbled as two detectives stormed in, guns holstered but faces grim, shouting, "You're under arrest for armed robbery." My heart thundered as they marched me out in handcuffs, still in my pajamas, and shoved me into the back of the police van. I had no warning, no idea what evidence they claimed to have. All I knew was that I stood accused of a crime I never committed, an armored car heist at a bank 2 miles from my campus. At the precinct, under harsh fluorescent lights, they showed me a forensic report. My fingerprints allegedly found on a gloved hand, used to load cash into getaway bags. I stared at the page in disbelief. My palms were sweat-soaked, but I recognized my prints nowhere near that crime scene. Yet the perito's signature attested to conclusive identification. 2 weeks later, in a cold courtroom, the judge read my sentence: 10 years in prison. I watched my parents' faces pale and defeated as the gavel fell. The word guilty echoed like a hammer to my chest. I tried to protest, to tell them the forensics were wrong, but no one seemed to listen. I became a statistic, a cautionary tale of evidence-based justice gone wrong. That night, alone in a holding cell, I wrapped my arms around my knees and wondered if this was how it would end, my dreams buried beneath a lie. My lawyer whispered that the forensic lab was reputable, state-of-the-art, he called it. I didn't know then that even the best labs can make mistakes. All I felt was crushing despair and a frantic need to prove my innocence. In those first hours, I swore I would uncover every detail of that faulty report. Even if it meant spending every waking moment studying forensic protocols, I would not let a single error dictate my life. I whispered into the darkness, "I will not be defined by this mistake," as they led me away to begin my 10-year sentence. A thought flickered: what if there was a way to revisit that forensic test? Could a single piece of overlooked evidence save me? The seed of hope was planted amid fear, and I clung to it like a lifeline. And so, my journey started with a broken heart and a fierce determination. Over the next 10 years, I would learn that even solid science can fail, and that sometimes, truth waits in the shadows of a simple lab error. At the police station, they sat me in a bright, cold interview room and slid a thick file across the table. "Tell us about the night of October 5th, the lead detective barked. My voice trembled as I recounted working late at the campus lab common room, cleaning equipment. I insisted I never set foot near the bank. The detective ignored me, flipping pages until he found the forensic report. "Your prints," he said, as if that settled everything. I leaned forward, heart pounding. But those gloves were brand new. They couldn't have picked up my prints unless I touched them after they left the factory, I argued. The detective's eyes narrowed. "Save it for the judge," he said, standing. They booked me later that afternoon, fingerprinting me on the same computer used to claim my prints at the crime scene. To me, it felt like they simply substituted one set of fingerprints for another. At my first court appearance, the clerk read the charges. Count 1, armed robbery, use of a firearm. Count 2, possession of stolen property. My family sat behind me, tears glistening in my mother's eyes. The prosecutor spoke in clipped, rehearsed lines. "The forensic evidence is incontrovertible." The judge set bail at $250,000, cash only. My father's face crumbled as he whispered, "We'll try." I felt unbearably guilty knowing we could never raise that kind of money. In my jail cell that night, I sobbed into my pillow, replaying every detail of that fateful day. I recalled working at the university, sleeves rolled up as I rinsed test tubes, my hands gloved the entire night. How could my bare fingerprints have ended up inside latex gloves allegedly used in the heist? I lay awake, mind racing through endless what-ifs. Every version of events led back to the same conclusion: someone's analysis was dead wrong. I barely recognized the courtroom for my preliminary hearing. The attorneys sat apart, piles of documents stacked before them. My public defender, a young woman named Clara Ramos, leaned close and said, "Jason, I need to review the forensic lab's chain of custody. Something doesn't add up." I nodded, relief mixing with fear. For the first time since my arrest, I felt a sliver of hope maybe Clara could find the flaw I sensed so deeply. Over the next days, Clara and I exchanged notes during jail visits. She showed me the lab report's fine print. The evidence had been transferred between 3 different technicians before analysis. Each handoff seemed documented but never scrutinized. My heart raced if any of those transfers had been careless or mislabeled. My prints could have been swapped with someone else's. Clara promised, "We'll find out." Meanwhile, the world outside labeled me guilty. Newspaper headlines and social media posts declared engineering student turned bank robber. Strangers in the jail shouted accusations as I walked the yard. Guards eyed me warily. I felt my identity erode with each passing day, replaced by a stain that would not wash off. Yet, in the back of my mind, I clung to one unwavering belief. If that forensic analysis was flawed, I could have my name back. As the preliminary hearing neared, Clara secured a court order to access the original evidence gloves, fingerprint kits, and the lab notebooks. On the morning of the hearing, I sat in the prisoner's box watching Clara present a chain of custody timeline to the judge, pointing out gaps and inconsistencies. The judge's eyes flickered with concern. In that moment, as Clara's voice echoed through the courtroom, I dared to believe that science, if properly examined, might set me free. Waking up in my cell that first morning was like surfacing from a nightmare only to find myself drowning in a new one. The steel door clanged open at 5:45 a.m., and I stumbled out onto the cold concrete floor. The fluorescent lights humming overhead felt like a spotlight on my humiliation. I washed my face at the grimy sink water, barely trickling from the spigot, and caught sight of myself in the scratched mirror, eyes hollow, cheeks sunken. I barely recognized the person staring back. By 6 a.m., we were herded into the chow hall for breakfast. A thin slab of sausage patty, undercooked eggs, and a cup of lukewarm coffee that tasted like regret. Across from me, another inmate with a weathered face and a sleeve of tattoos watched in silence. I tried to make small talk a first time, but he only shrugged. In that moment, I understood. We were all defined by our worst moments here, whether we deserved it or not. The prison yard at 8 a.m. felt like a vast cage beyond dimensions. We filed outside under the watchful eyes of guards, perched atop towers. The sky was a dull gray, and the chain-link fence glinted in the weak sunlight. I found a patch of cracked asphalt and leaned against the fence, wishing I could slip through the wires and vanish. Instead, I watched as other inmates kicked around a scuffed-up soccer ball, their laughter hollow and brittle. It stung to see them at ease. At least they belonged here. Inside my cell, I tried to piece together the forensics report in my mind. I mapped out each transfer of evidence, who handled the gloves, when the kits were opened, every signature in the lab logbook. But my thoughts kept drifting back to my parents' faces when they heard the sentence. My mom's tears at the sentencing hearing, my dad's silent rage. I felt responsible for their grief, powerless to comfort them from behind these bars. Nights were the worst. Beneath the dim bulb, I lay on the thin mattress, listening to the steady drip of the communal sink and distant murmurs of other prisoners. I tried to pray, but my prayers felt hollow. Were they empty words now that I was inside this living tomb? I turned to my journal, a tattered notebook I somehow managed to keep. I wrote in shaky handwriting late into the night. I refuse to let this define me. I will find the truth. I spent hours studying the books Clara smuggled out, dated forensic textbooks, federal guidelines on evidence handling. Sometimes I whispered passages to myself in the dark, struggling to absorb every technical detail. Other inmates occasionally peeked in, curious about my studies. A lanky guy named Ramirez, a former lab tech accused of embezzlement, leaned in one day and said, "If you're serious, check the transfer logs. They're often overlooked." His words echoed. Someone who knew the system, subtly confirming that errors happen. Over the weeks, a routine emerged: roll call, meals, yard, cell, library. Yet beneath that monotony, I tunneled deeper into analyzing the flawed lab report. I scoured every page for anomalies, handwriting that didn't match the sign-off, dates that overlapped in impossible ways, unclear custody stamps. Each discovery felt like a small victory, a reminder that the truth was more solid than the lie I was forced to bear. Even in despair, a flicker of hope grew. I began to see that time behind bars didn't strictly belong to the prison walls, it was also a chance to build my case, piece by painstaking piece, as the cell door clanged shut. Each night, I whispered to myself, "You'll see the truth soon, I promise," and as I drifted into a restless sleep, those words were the only comfort I had. By my third year inside, the initial shock had faded, replaced by a relentless drive to understand exactly how that forensic lab had failed me. Clara had arranged for me to receive photocopies of the original evidence log, a handful of worn, yellowed pages scribbled with dates, times, and initials. I spread those photocopies on the narrow metal desk in my cell and stared at them under the dim bulb. The margins were cramped, the handwriting rushed, and some signatures overlapped. My pulse quickened as I realized if one of these custodial entries was wrong, it could unravel the entire case. A fellow inmate, Javier, an ex-police cadet turned drug offender, noticed me poring over the documents. One afternoon, he slipped a folded scrap of paper under my door. Inside was a hastily scribbled note, "Check Exhibit A, line 7, looks off." I unfolded it with shaking fingers. On the original evidence log, Exhibit A referred to the latex gloves supposedly tested for fingerprints. Line 7 listed R. Thompson as the person who logged the gloves into the lab refrigerator. But when I cross-referenced to the lab staff roster, R. Thompson hadn't worked there for 2 years. My breath caught, a ghost name in a critical chain of custody document. For days, I replayed that discovery in my mind. If R. Thompson was a phantom, then the gloves might never have been stored properly, or the labels swapped. I scribbled frantic notes in my battered notebook, dates, roster comparisons, phone numbers for people I'd never met. I confided in Clara during our brief weekly visit. They used a name that doesn't exist. The entire chain could be broken, she nodded, eyes fierce with determination. We'll hire an independent forensic analyst. See if they can replicate the test or spot more errors. Meanwhile, I learned to navigate the prison's limited resources. During yard time, I struck up a cautious friendship with Marcus, a former lab assistant serving time for a DUI manslaughter. He had recognized the lab's logo on my photocopies. One afternoon, he leaned in close and whispered, "I once worked with that team. They cut corners switching samples, mislabeling vials. I got fired years ago because I complained." His revelation was both terrifying and exhilarating, a direct confirmation that the lab was known for sloppy work. Armed with that information, I became meticulous. In the prison's tiny library, I pored over a dusty volume of forensic standards and protocols. I wrote notes on scrap paper, piecing together a timeline, when the gloves arrived, who signed each form, and every possible moment contamination could occur. I pictured the lab tech carelessly dropping a pair of gloves on a bench, mixing them with another batch. My mind raced with what-if scenarios, until I fell asleep, exhausted but fueled by a glimmer of possibility. Clara coordinated with an outside lab, a small independent facility specializing in cold case reviews. She sent over my notarized affidavits and chain of custody copies. One evening, email arrived in her inbox, though I wouldn't see it for weeks, confirming they would re-examine the DNA swabs and glove samples. Every time the clank of the cell door announced our meeting, I clung to hope. Maybe these new experts could find the contamination I couldn't see on paper. Then, more good news. One of the original lab's former technicians, a shy woman named Claire Nguyen, quietly agreed to testify. She'd left the lab under murky circumstances and now worked as a forensic consultant. She sent Claire a detailed affidavit describing how the lab had once rerun multiple cases because of mislabeled swabs. Her statement added weight. The lab's reputation for error was no secret. In my cell, I read her affidavit until the lines blurred, tears in my eyes, proof that I wasn't imagining things. As the 10th year of my sentence neared its end, the pieces of my exoneration puzzle were finally falling into place. The independent lab's preliminary findings, Claire's affidavit, and my meticulously documented chain of custody chart formed a mosaic of doubt. Each time I looked at those pieces, I felt my resolve strengthen. I would step into that courtroom with everything I'd gathered, and I would not leave until my name was cleared. The morning of the review hearing arrived with a mix of dread and exhilaration. Clara arrived early at the courthouse, briefcase in hand, her eyes resolute. She'd assured me that all the new evidence, Claire Nguyen's affidavit, the independent lab's findings, and my detailed chain of custody logs would be overwhelming. I was led into the courtroom, still in my prison uniform, while my family watched from the gallery, their faces etched with hope and anxiety. The judge entered, her robe swaying with quiet authority. The prosecutor stood to present his case, clutching the original lab report. He argued that the state's long-standing procedures couldn't be undermined by an unverified, hearsay affidavit. His tone was condescending, as if suggesting that a poor kid from prison had no right to challenge a state lab's conclusions. I felt a surge of anger, but swallowed it. Today was not the day to lose my composure. Clara rose to speak. She calmly outlined the independent lab's report, which conclusively demonstrated that the DNA samples on the gloves had been cross-contaminated with another case's sample. She presented detailed photographs of mislabeled vials, chain of custody gaps, and Claire Nguyen's testimony describing routine mix-ups in that lab. When she asked to play the lab tech's recorded statement, each word echoed through the courtroom. I saw technicians swap vials. I witnessed mislabeled evidence. As the independent lab report appeared on the courtroom screen, I watched the faces of the jurors. No jury this time, just the judge shift from neutrality to astonished doubt. The prosecutor fumbled through rebuttal notes, but found no counter-argument to Claire Nguyen's inside knowledge. My breaths grew shallow. I felt my heart pound as each line of evidence dismantled the case against me. The weight of a decade of wrongful imprisonment seemed to lift, if only slightly. The turning point came when my father took the stand as a character witness. He recounted my life before the arrest, a diligent student, a loving son, and a future engineer. He described how I had never so much as received a traffic ticket, how I'd worked 2 jobs to save for college. His voice trembled when he said, "I never doubted his innocence for 1 second." My mother's silent tears in the audience reminded me of the sacrifice they'd made visiting week after week, writing letters, juggling my legal expenses with their own dwindling savings. Clara then called Claire Nguyen to the stand. Draped in business attire, Claire's calm demeanor belied the storm of information she brought. She described specific instances she'd witnessed at the state lab, a supervisor instructing technicians to clean up mislabeled vials quickly, and evidence protocols being ignored during high-volume case months. Each revelation drove the prosecutor's objections out of steam, and the judge signaled her willingness to consider a new narrative. Finally, the judge reviewed all the new documents. Time seemed to stop as she scanned chain of custody photocopies, comparing them to those from the independent lab. I held my breath, imagining the moment she would write vacate on my case. Then, looking up, she addressed the courtroom. Based on the overwhelming evidence of contamination and mishandling, this court finds the original conviction unsupported by reliable forensic science. The conviction is vacated, and the defendant is hereby exonerated. A swell of relief crashed through me as the bailiff unclaimed my shackles. Clara and I locked eyes. Her restrained smile spoke volumes. My family rushed forward, tears streaming, hugging me so tightly I felt breathless. Exiting the courtroom, I took one final look back at the empty dock, where a false narrative had held me for 10 years. Today, truth prevailed. Today, I was free. Walking out of that courthouse under the midday sun felt surreal, as though I had blinked and entered a different world. My mother gripped my hand, her knuckles white but triumphant, and my father offered a silent nod of pride. My sister ran to hug me, her young face streaked with tears of joy. In that small moment, I understood that exoneration was not just a legal victory, it was the reclamation of a life stolen from me. In the weeks that followed, I returned to the modest apartment where I'd once dreamed of engineering school. The familiar hum of the refrigerator and the soft scent of coffee ground my reality. I was home. I opened the stack of unopened mail. Most letters were apologies from old friends or deferments from universities willing to give me a second chance. I smiled at each one, knowing that rebuilding would begin from here. One afternoon, I visited the forensic science department at the very university I'd been about to transfer to a decade ago. The dean greeted me warmly, eyes filled with regret for the ripple effects of the state lab's errors. They offered me a full scholarship to complete my engineering degree and also tasked me with auditing their lab's protocols. Standing in that lab, once a place of betrayal, now felt like a symbol of redemption, the chance to ensure no one else would endure what I did. I also reconnected with Clara, who became a close friend and mentor. She introduced me to a nonprofit dedicated to reviewing wrongful convictions, where I now volunteer as a case reviewer. We share a common mission: to prevent future injustices and to advocate for transparency in forensic science. Clara's perseverance ignited my own passion for justice beyond my personal story. In the evenings, I often sit at my old desk, meticulously studying engineering textbooks while referencing forensic science articles. I dream of designing software that tracks chain of custody digitally, eradicating human error from evidence. Handling each equation and line of code I write is a tribute to the years I lost and a promise that my expertise will protect others. My family's household now echoes with laughter. My sister's pranks, my mother's cooking, and my father's gentle teasing. We celebrate every small victory: a job interview, a passing grade, as though the world has given us a second shot. Yet, I never forget the decade in the shadows, the nights I spent questioning if I'd ever see daylight again. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that science is powerful, but it's fallible. The systems we trust, police, forensic labs, courts, must be held accountable. I share my story at community forums and speak with aspiring forensic students, urging them to remember the human life behind every sample. I remind them, a drop of DNA, a fingerprint, is not just evidence, it belongs to a person with a story that deserves truth. As I close this chapter, I look to the future with cautious optimism. I'm rebuilding my life, step by step, but I promise to carry the lessons of those 10 years with me always. To anyone watching who feels forgotten by the system, know this: your voice matters. Even in the darkest cell, hope can be kindled by a single error uncovered, a single truth revealed. I am living proof.